Hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Beating the Capacity Crunch. We're pleased you could join us as we look forward to sharing knowledge on how to successfully manage trucking capacity from two experts who have a combined experience of 47 years in the trucking industry. My name is Kathy Robertson and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. But before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items. Please note the slides will advance automatically throughout the presentation. To enlarge the slides, click the Enlarge Slides button located in the top right-hand corner of your presentation window. Should you need technical assistance, click on the Help widget located on the bottom left corner of your console. We encourage you to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation using the Q&A widget at the bottom of your console. We'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of this presentation. Following the presentation, you'll be able to access the on-demand recording of the webinar using the same link from today's live event. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. With us today are Matt Meeks, Vice President, Strategic Capacity and Carrier Experience for ArcBest, and Ed Wadel, Executive Vice President of Asset Light Expedited Services and Strategic Capacity for ArcBest. In today's webinar, we will discuss practical ways for shippers and carriers to work together to manage capacity in the most efficient and economical manner. We've asked our subject matter experts to share their best practices in how shippers and carriers can work together successfully in managing capacity through modal selection and technology tools. At the end of this webinar, we hope you'll gain a better understanding in the importance of working together as well as in managing capacity effectively and economically. But before we get into the how-tos, let's first consider how we got here in the first place. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Matt Meeks, Vice President of Strategic Capacity and Carrier Experience for ArcBest. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. The capacity situation didn't simply happen overnight. It seems like several trends converged and created a perfect storm for shippers and carriers alike. So Matt, in your opinion, what are some of these trends?
Kathy, yeah, thanks for including me in today's webinar. I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, I do think it's interesting the way you phrased that question is, this didn't happen overnight. And to a degree, that's correct. This is something that's been building for years and years. You mentioned at the beginning of this how long myself and Ed combined have been in this industry of 47 years. Myself, it's about 21. And really for the entirety of my career, I've heard this conversation around the challenges we have with capacity. And one of those challenges has been a running theme is a driver shortage. Right now, if you look at the ATA's data, it says we're about 50,000 drivers short of what we need to match the economy and the supply chain, and that's going to continue to increase with years to come and be somewhere around 175,000 drivers short in 2025. So you're right, that didn't happen overnight. That's been a consistent theme, and the challenges in trying to recruit people into the driver world, they remain today and will continue, as that is just a challenging job to get into. One of the things that did happen overnight and kind of started the capacity crunch that we're still feeling today was the disruption in the supply chain, and that was back with the hurricanes of Harvey and Irma back in 2017. They literally were a trigger point to the crunch. And then what we typically see is when you have, whether it's a hurricane season or you have the snowpocalypse we had 3 or 4 years ago that hit and shut down the Chicago area, is the supply chain gets disrupted, capacity is a mess for a few months, and then it normalizes and everything comes back to norm and we figure things out again. Well, what seemed to keep happening though was then the next shoe dropped, and so we have our normal driver shortages we've been dealing with for years, and then we moved in and we got hit with a couple of hurricanes that were significant in areas that were vital to our overall supply chain in this country. And then we saw the next thing happen, and the next thing was the ELD mandate. ELDs came in at the end of 2017, hit in December, basically had a soft implementation to some degree from FMCSA and DOT and how they were going to drive compliance. But let us work through that those first few months of 18, and in April said, here's a hard mandate. You're going to have to start having your ELDs and be compliant. And what we saw was challenges of just change impacting people's ability and drivers' ability to go run their trucks effectively. But we also saw, the requirement that everybody does run with what is required of the DOT hours of service. And so that drew back some of that capacity that maybe was running a little stronger than it should. And so, we kind of have these layering effects of first you have the driver shortage that we continually deal with, and then we had that adverse impact of climate and hitting two big markets. And then the next thing was the ELD mandate. And then, the thing that me and you and everybody probably listening to this call we all love, we have a strong economy. So, we're continuing to see job numbers, overall low unemployment drop, job numbers increase, and that's drawing guys away that might have come into the driver market to go back and do something local. So the guy that's been on the road 3, 4, 5 weeks at a time regularly, going home 1 week and then back out on the road, he's looking and saying, hey, I can get a job working in construction or working somewhere else and get a chance to live a little different life. And so continuing that challenge of bringing new driver entrants into the market. Another challenge we see and just consistently have seen, historically with the driver market, the aging demographic of it and trying to compare it to the overall economy. The last numbers I saw said the average driver, over-the-road driver, was almost 50 years old, and the average employee in the economy was about 42 years old. So we're looking at someone in the range that's about 20 to 25% older than the rest of the economy, and so you start seeing that attrition of retirements. You start seeing health issues at those ages start peeling people away. And again, it layers in and creates more challenges to growing that driver capacity you need to meet the demands of our supply chain. And then finally, we just see the changes of the supply chain. You and I and everybody else right now have a different perspective on what we expect when we hit order. That Amazon effect of, hey, I hit order and now I immediately want to see what's going on and I want to see it faster. And just the challenges of a changing supply chain there that is driving change and driving the ways that the actual operators of the trucks do business is creating pinch points and challenges of what we're doing each and every day.
Thanks, Matt, for your insightful thoughts. It certainly sounds like the situation has been stormy for both the shipper and carrier. Researchers and analysts alike have always emphasized the importance of collaboration among supply chain partners, and perhaps collaboration could help shippers and carriers alike manage capacity constraints. I'd like to introduce Ed Wadel, Executive Vice President, Asset Light Expedited Services and Strategic Capacity for ArcBest. Ed, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. How important is it for shippers and carriers to work together?
Thank you, Kathy. I think it's more important than ever that shippers and carriers are working together. Matt talked about the tight capacity and the storm that's brewing out there right now and has been for quite a while with capacity. And with the shipper and the carrier working together and sharing data and collaborating is just so important as you look at it. The carrier understanding the shipper supply chain is critical in the situation. So how can that carrier help the shipper in more ways, and how can the shipper work with the carrier? Matt talked about the ELD mandate that came down, and the drivers are under tight hours and to use their clock and hours of service. And one way that can happen from the shipper is just when that carrier does arrive, whether it's a scheduled time to pick the freight up or to deliver that freight, it's so critical that the driver gets loaded in a timely fashion, whether it's unloaded or loaded. The other big piece to this is just the shippers with flexible and extending their hours. The norm of 8 to 5 doesn't always work. And so by that collaboration of the carriers and shippers working together to get that freight there on time and not have service failures, not have outages for the shipper or for that carrier. It's essential that their productivity and that they're using their clock for that hours of service. The other piece that plays a big part in the hours of service is, and for the shipper, is that ad hoc freight. So there's a lot of scheduled freight that's out there. They order truckload and they have their regular schedule, but we know things happen in the supply chain. So that carrier understanding that supply chain and communicating back to that carrier when there is as much notification as possible. And I think there's a lot of tools, and the market's really changing, that the carriers and the shippers, they have a lot of data, and the shippers can forecast their demands. And how do we work together from the standpoint of the carrier and the shipper and communicate back and forth? Another big piece of the shipper and the carrier working together, I would call it like treat the driver like a customer. So easy to do business with. We talk about that a lot of times, where working with our customers, how do we as a carrier become easier to do business with? It's also that way for the shipper, easy to do business with that carrier. And what I mean by that, there's a big issue with the hours of service and break time for these drivers. And you look at the truck stops and parking access for these drivers. If the shipper has the room for it, and they can park and take their breaks after they unload or before they unload, that's a big deal to that carrier. Restrooms and break rooms, that's also. And when you say these things, and Wi-Fi, having access to Wi-Fi is also a great feature for that driver. And when it all comes down to it, you really look at a term for that is like shipper of choice. And the drivers really believe in this, and I think the shippers should strive for that, being a shipper of choice for that driver when he comes in, and build that relationship and make it stronger. I talked about the supply chain. I really think the forecasting of demands, I'll repeat that a little bit. It's just so important to get deeper into that supply chain. So shippers know they have a press go down if it's an assembly plant and they're shipping goods out. When that press comes back up, it's real important to be communicating with that carriers that they're going to have a spike in outbound demand out of that plant. You also get stacked up on an inbound. The more orders come in. Matt talked about it a little bit with the digital and everything that's changing out in the marketplace, and that demand to get that product out to market. It's becoming real critical that everybody communicates. Matt, I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to add to this.
Not yet. I think you really nailed it with that point of treating the driver like a customer and trying to cater to some of their needs to make you that shipper of choice is more important now than it's ever been in what we're doing, because there's a changing face of the supply chain, and having a good driver partner is a big deal.
Thanks so much, Ed. Matt's call out of treating the driver like a customer is a really interesting one, and one that I think a lot of folks can take away and easily implement if it's not being implemented already. But strong relationships between shippers and carriers can potentially result in creative solutions for problems such as capacity constraints. Modal selection, whether it's the use of one mode of transport or more than one mode of transport, can prove beneficial to shippers and carriers alike. Matt, can you expand upon the importance of modal selection and how to determine the best fit based on a shipper's needs?
Okay, that's a good question, and I do think it's an important one, because it's easy to get into a mindset of, there's a one way to do business and it's this way. And, being a shipper of choice or just having creative relationships within logistics is necessary to really have an effective supply chain. Whether it's, truckload, LTL, or, intermodal, understanding when to execute and what to execute is really going to position you best to, one, source the capacity you need, and two, do it cost effectively. There's times where intermodal is going to be your best solution because it meets your price and service commitment to your customer, and it lets you leverage those dollars you're spending within your transportation budget. Where at another time, it would be a huge cost of failure because you'd be maybe 3 or 4 days late to meet your customer's on-time requirement. So one of the things that we try to discuss with both customers and also help our providers understand there's a balance between cost of failure and cost of transportation. And so as you go through that modal selection, you're trying to understand all the little aspects of the shipment you're trying to execute on and then maximize the value of that shipment and the cost to move it. If you've got a situation where maybe product needs to be somewhere within 24 hours and it's a truckload quantity, well, do you really need to move the entire truckload within the next 20 and get it somewhere within 24 hours, or do you need to move a pallet and have it there within 24 hours and the other 25 pallets can arrive in a normal truckload mode? Well, understanding the cost value of blending your modes there is critical. It's critical to really optimizing your transportation spend and delivering value to your customer base. So as you work to make those choices, whether you're going to do something that, as a truckload or LTL, or you're planning for the future and how intermodal might fit into that marketplace for you and how you structure your supply chain, it's pretty critical to understand all the different ways freight can move and whether you should be looking at, straight trucks or cargo vans or tractor trailers or whatever it might be to really develop the best solution that meets all those needs.
Thanks so much, Matt. Now, one of the most fascinating areas within the supply chain is technology. Technology is playing a big role in today's supply chains. From inventory management to track and trace, it seems new technology tools are being offered almost on a daily basis. In addition, trucks themselves are getting a tech makeover. Ed, what role is technology playing in managing capacity? And do you see any emerging technologies that could play a role in capacity management?
Oh, thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I think, we're living in a world of change, fast, digital world, and it's changing every day. And really what brings this technology into play is we have access to the big data. So you hear the phrase out there a lot of big data. And the issue is everyone's collecting a lot of data, but once again, how do you work together with the shipper and the carrier and utilize this data? And there is new technology coming into the market all the time. You hear, AI and AI-based optimization drives down congestion, inefficiencies, and thus driving down the cost. So when you think about that, how it can really play, and how do you use this data? And really, when you're looking at predictive analytics, you have leading indicators and you have lagging indicators. And this is in the supply chain, and I talked about it a little earlier, when a press goes down, and how do you notify when inventory's out? And Matt referred to it too. This inventory's moving in and out and best optimizing it. But it's also on the capacity side. The capacity side's lagging behind on that, and they have more and more data. We talked about the ELD mandate. With that comes a lot of data from the ELDs. So we're getting a better view into the capacity and the available capacity out there in the market. Matt just talked about it. When you're looking at whether is this really the best mode for a full truckload, when you have a regular truckload scheduled, but you're only using 2 pallets out of that truckload. That's really not the best mode. And to have everyone react to that, it's difficult at times across the company, but by using data and sending out, be proactive in sending out alerts back and forth and sharing this data becomes just critical to be able to shoot those alerts out and predict what's going to happen. So with all this data and being able to combine it together with capacity and with that supply chain, that's where you really win. You can be ahead of an outbound problem. You know that you have a lot of outbound coming out of here, and it's just not one shipper either. It could be a market that is turning really hot, and getting visibility into that market and be able to push capacity towards that market, that's a win for the shipper, and that's a big win for the carrier too. So not just that ad hoc freight at the last minute, but the sooner that we get ahead of this, the better off that we are. We have machine learning. So before, it's always been use this data. Big data's been around for a while. We had a lot of tools that you could run reports. You had analysts, data scientists that are looking at this data. Now we have machine learning. So now with all this data that's coming at the machine and that machine learning from itself and kicking out these leading and lagging indicators, that's when it's a big win across the board. So I think I covered that question, but Matt, do you have anything that you might want to add to that?
No, that's really good stuff. You know, you're right. There's a lot to be utilized and coming with between AI and the machine learning piece that we're just not utilizing today on the supply chain side of the business. That's going to change the way the driver does work and the way we interact with our shippers.
Thanks so much, Ed. It's certainly sounding like a brave new world type of atmosphere that's occurring. And speaking of which, Matt, what about the truck itself? How has the truck changed, and how does it affect capacity management?
Well, I mean, just with technology in general, we're seeing more and more sensors and things of that nature put into the things we use, and it's putting us in a better position, one, to reduce overall downtime with the vehicle and do a better job of coaching up our drivers. In talking to some of my friends and those folks in the business and some of the technology they're employing to drive their fleets, it's interesting to hear about some of the things they've done with the ELD mandate. As an example, you know, smaller fleets. A friend of mine has 25 trucks. He didn't have ELDs until the mandate came along, and with that mandate, what he's learned is he can go in there and do some things to coach up his drivers to do a better job to, one, drive more safely, and two, do it in a way that's going to reduce claims. So that ELD tool that, one, has slowed down and hurt him a little bit on the productivity side, he's now leveraging to come in and saving money other places, like in reduced tickets, reduced turnover with drivers because of failures around tickets and unsafe driving, and in turn also reduce claims by doing a better job of coaching up around, you know, stopping and not doing hard braking and things of that nature. So there's areas where technology is playing in and giving us value back to improving the supply chain. That maybe there's a trade-off in that scenario of the ELD slowed down productivity, but it's giving a trade-off by improving safety and reducing claim costs and things of that nature. The other thing that we're looking at is just what are we getting into the driver's hands? Things like, you know, mobile apps. What is that doing to make the driver more productive and give us better feedback in regards to load coverage and load delivery, load pickup, things of that nature? You know, what are we doing around, you know, one of the problems that Ed brought up earlier around being a shipper of choice? How are we passing along good information to drivers around best cost on fuel, best likelihood of finding a clean shower, best likelihood of finding a place to park? Because again, parking is a major issue on the highways and the freeways for drivers when they're trying to get in and out of congested areas. You know, the big question, and the one that everybody thinks is going to revolutionize all of transportation, is the autonomous vehicle. You know, there are tons and tons of companies spending a lot of money trying to figure out ways to, one, help with our driver shortage by doing some replacement there with an autonomous vehicle. And there are strides being made there. You know, there's daily tests are being run with a driverless vehicle in certain markets right now out west to try to, you know, optimize and really create a tool that can be used by the industry. Concepts of platooning to, you know, reduce the fatigue on the drivers that are maybe in behind the lead truck that are helping drive, you know, better productivity and a better lifestyle for our driver community is going to help with that. And then, you know, finally getting into the, you know, I think was touched on a little bit earlier is the, you know, that Internet of Things. You know, taking all that data between sensors that are telling us how things are operating, sensors telling us, you know, what's not being used, and how do you know, mash all that together to optimize the way we do business, whether it's, you know, moving a truckload of freight from point A to point B, whether it's putting something on a plane, or whether it's utilizing, you know, a passenger vehicle to make a small item delivery. It's really dragging down all that information we've got floating around and finding better ways to optimize how we do business each and every day.
Thanks, Matt. Today's environment is one of great economic growth. However, underneath this growth is a transportation network under massive strain. Not only is there demand for more goods, but the need for faster delivery times. To meet these needs, carriers are ordering more trucks and recruiting more drivers, all while complying with government regulations. At the same time, shippers are faced with rising transportation costs and lack of capacity, potentially causing friction between the shipper and the carrier. In today's webinar, Matt and Ed shared best practices for how shippers and carriers can work smarter together, as well as suggestions for modal selection and the use of technology in managing capacity. As shippers and carriers work closer together, these best practices can be utilized to achieve success for both businesses. Now that we've concluded the formal portion of our webinar, Matt and Ed have graciously agreed to field a short question and answer session. We'll answer as many questions as possible in the time that we have now, and we'll email the answers to any remaining questions after the webinar. Our first question from the audience is ensuring capacity for expedited services different? And if so, how?
Oh, that's a great question, Kathy. This is Ed. I'll field that question. When you look at the expedite service, it really lives around that ad hoc world. It's different than the scheduled freight that's out there. And a lot of this freight runs live load, live unload. And by saying that, I mean when they call in for an expedite shipment, it's usually an emergency shipment. So it's critical that when they do call in for it, to find that capacity and get it into position. So you can think that it's not scheduled, so it's a real challenge to be able to ad hoc in and get there to pick up that freight and deliver it direct. But what we found over the years is that expedite, it moves around in these shipments, so we do see pockets. So rather than the standard terminals that are out there or service centers that are around the country, the expedite runs more on a virtual terminal. So it's not a physical building, but you can drive into hot spots by identifying that expedite shipment. The other piece that comes into expedite is the security and the high-value product and length of haul. There's teams. There's a lot of teams that are in demand. There's not time for that freight to be swapped out at a location. So that length of haul and having teams so that they can run that direct becomes real important. It's a challenge for capacity on this when I talk about ad hoc. So the carrier or that driver for the carrier, they're not getting home all the time. Home time is a big deal when you're talking about the expedite and be able to schedule that. But they're out on the road and they're not on a scheduled thing where they get home every night.
Wow, I can imagine. Thanks so much, Ed. That's a great answer and a good question, too. We've got another question from the audience. And Matt, get your crystal ball out. This one's perfect for you. So how long will the capacity situation continue?
That is a crystal ball type question, Kathy. Thank you. You know, looking into this, there's a lot of different things that are impacting the market today. Right now, I would say the economy is one thing. If it stays at the pace we're going at, what we'll see is we'll steadily see some more drivers come in the market. It'll start to normalize, hopefully, and it won't go away. We'll still have our challenges, but that'll help. If we see a big downturn in the economy, capacity will come available. That's just what we see. There'll be less shipments out on the road, and there'll be plenty of trucks to handle them, and so we'll see that fix it. You know, we talked about autonomous trucks before. That's not an overnight fix. It's going to take a lot of time to bring any type of autonomous vehicle in making meaningful impact on the market, just simply because of how many trucks are out operating today and having to try to bring those autonomous vehicles in to replace the current inventory that's out operating on the street. So yes, they'll have an impact at some point, but will it be an overnight flip the switch and fix everything? No, that won't do it. And then ultimately, you know, I thought it was interesting. I've seen some interesting anecdotes around problems and how problems are solved, and I don't know where it came from, but one of the comments that I heard multiple times is when you see a problem and it gets big enough, two things happen: money and technology come to the rescue. So, you know, technology is going to continue to be a big part of our economy and our lives, and you're going to see things come in that are driven by money to give us the opportunity to use technology to make what we do from a supply chain and the capacity needs, situation help drive change and help improve the capacity situation we're in right now.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Here's another question that's coming from the audience for you too. So what about cross-border services? How can a shipper make sure she has the right capacity to deliver into Canada and or Mexico?
Oh, that's another great question, Kathy. This is Ed, and I'll field that question. The number one thing with Canada or going into Mexico, in or out of Canada or in or out of Mexico, is really just getting that paperwork in order. And we talked about collaboration during this call. It's just so important that collaboration happens between that shipper and that carrier where you're crossing at the border, and to make sure that you have the proper bonds and the paperwork in order for the freight that's crossing over. It's a critical piece to it. The other piece that happens with crossing our service, we can't control any kind of delays at the border, but what we can control, we talked about big data, we talked about just visibility into the supply chain. So where is it when you're coming in and out of Mexico is a great example of the heavy northbound coming out or the southbound. It seems like the border down in Mexico, it gets out of balance. Same thing happens with Canada, and being able to align that capacity with what we're seeing in the market as there's spikes in the products that are crossing that border becomes so important. And I'd also like to fall back to the ELD mandate. We've talked about a lot, but hours of service. You can imagine when you get delayed at the border and being able to cross at the border, the hours of service and allowing for that in your supply chain, and when you order that freight, it's real important to bring that in. And so when you cross the border, there's a couple options that you have when you cross the border. You can transload or cross-dock. That's a great opportunity for a carrier and a shipper to work together and really understand, can I consolidate some of this freight? Can you cross-dock it there? Or is it traveling straight through? So, if it's a drop and hook scenario and you're taking that trailer into Mexico, you have to have an interchange set up with that carrier already. So you're handing off from one carrier to another when you go into Mexico. In Canada, it's a little different. You can cross and drive into Canada, so it changes it a little bit. But that drop and hook and trailer pulls versus a cross-dock and transload, that's where the shipper has an opportunity to really work with the carrier. And the last point I would make on this question is really finding a partnership with a carrier that can take ownership of your freight from the shipper to the final destination. So that final destination might be in the interior of Mexico or in the interior of Canada, but for that supply chain and that visibility of that freight and having a company that takes complete ownership of that freight from point A to point B is just critical for that shipper.
That's great. Thanks, Ed. We've got time for one more question, and here it is. When should one use air?
Since that's a question about mode, and I talked a little bit about it earlier, Kathy, I'll jump in. And we talked about it in that previous slide. It's really around the cost of failure. If it's going to cost you, you or your customer more to not have that freight delivered on time and when you need it, then it's going to cost to put it on an airplane. Then it's time to put it on an airplane. Now, there are limiters to that. There's certain commodities, and whether it's because of what it is or how it's shaped, it's going to limit your ability to put it on a plane. But you really do have to balance that cost of the good, the cost of the transportation, against the need to get that good where it's supposed to be. So, typically you see a lot of very high-value product moving, high-value, small, dense product moving on airlines. Something to think about there is a number of cell phones and things, technology like that moves there. But, moving back to that reference I talked about, you have 26 pallets of freight that needs to be to a customer in 2 days, and you're jammed up and you're a day behind. Do you now need to move 26 pallets of freight overnight, or do you need to move something less than that to keep that plant running for 3 or 4 days, or to get that sale going in that store, or whatever it might be to meet that customer's needs, getting them what they actually need for the time frame, and then maybe moving the balance of that in a different mode to balance your cost. That's really the key factor there, is again, balancing what mode you're going to choose, whether it's air or over the road or rail, or using a straight truck or a sprinter van, whatever it might be, balancing against the failure of not getting the freight where it belongs on time is the key to that whole discussion.
Great point. Thanks so much, Matt. Well, that's all the time we have today. A big thanks to today's speakers, Matt Meeks and Ed Wadel, and of course our audience for joining us. As a reminder, today's webinar will be available on demand, and a link will be sent to you after the webinar. Have a great day, everyone.